So let's continue our study of logic with formal fallacies. And this is a great way to be introduced to symbolic or formal logic. Also in this video I'll tell you how to be teleported to other dimensions. So before beginning, take a look at the arguments on the screen and evaluate those. Now if you don't like that sort of thing, just skip it. Okay? Remember last time in chapter 3 or in the video 22 Common Fallacies, we explored informal fallacies. Now we're going to explore formal fallacies. Informal fallacies are those in which you must examine the content. You cannot tell if it's fallacious by its form alone. So for example, the composition fallacy is informal because it's sometimes valid to infer the quality of the whole from the parts and sometimes invalid. You have to examine the content in each case, as you see on the screen. Formal fallacies, on the other hand, are arguments with a bad form or inference. You don't have to look at the content. You don't have to think about the meaning of the words. You can see the arguments are fallacious by their form alone. For example, the following argument is fallacious by its form alone. All A are B, therefore all B are A. Okay? All A are B, therefore all B are A. Now, this form of argument is always and absolutely fallacious or invalid. It doesn't matter what A and B represent as long as A and B represent different things. Because we can tell by its form alone that it's fallacious, it's called a formal fallacy. And to clarify, just plug in some meanings for A and B, or as you can see on the screen here, right? So all cats are animals, therefore all animals are cats. Okay. All bears are strange creatures, so all strange creatures are bears. I don't even have to think about why you're giving me this strange argument about strange bears. Right? What are you smoking? I don't have to think about that. I can just see it's a formal fallacy. Right? Now, they all have bad form, or to use a vocabulary from earlier, they have a bad inference. So even if we assume the premise is true in these arguments, the conclusion doesn't follow. And that's the point. We don't need to think about the content to evaluate them. We can immediately see they're fallacious or invalid by their form alone. Okay? So we don't have to think about the relationship between cats and animals, bears and strange creatures, or whatever. Now, this formal fallacy is called illicit conversion, and it goes way back to Aristotle. So if you study the first form of formal logic, symbolic logic, called categorical or Aristotelian logic, you would learn it and many other formal fallacies. Okay, now maybe you can see one reason at this point why studying symbolic or formal logic is valuable. It trains you to see arguments in form, so you can more quickly and accurately evaluate their validity, whether they're good or fallacious, right? So again, we can say that it's always and absolutely invalid to infer all B or A from all A or B, right? As long as A and B represent different things. Okay, so I started with a really clear and easy example. Let's consider a more difficult argument form that often arises in IQ tests and entrance exams. Now, such exams may present one of the following arguments that you see on the screen. Okay, and they'll ask you, is it a good argument? So the first argument says, if I'm happy, then I'm singing, therefore I'm happy. So if A, then B, right? B, therefore A. The last argument there said, if God exists and there's good in the world, there is good in the world, therefore God exists. It takes the same form. Now, interestingly, over 65% of people mark these arguments as good, but they're actually incorrect. Right? Now, a person who studies formal logic will know this immediately, because these arguments take the same fallacious form called affirming the consequent. And that form is if A then B, B therefore A. So students of symbolic logic don't have to work out the relationship between singing and happiness in the first argument, or God and goodness, which can be quite confusing in the last argument. They just reduce it to the form, and they're done. Right? Now, you might want to think about how you would change these arguments to make them better. In the end, you would change it to a form like this that you see on the left. If A, then B, A, therefore B. And this is called modus ponens, this form of argument, and it's always valid. Okay, so instead of the fallacious argument, we can change it around a bit and say, if I'm happy, then I'm happy, therefore I'm singing. Okay, instead of A and B, let me use the letters P and Q. So it would be if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. That's modus ponens, it's always valid. Okay, now let me give you a note on vocabulary here. These arguments contain what are called conditional statements, which are if-then statements. So the antecedent is the part that comes first, and the consequent is the part that comes second. So for example, if I say if A, then B, that's a conditional statement because it's an if-then statement. And A comes first, if A then B, so A is the antecedent, and B comes second, so B is the consequent. And this might help you better understand why that fallacy that we just went over is called affirming the consequent. Okay, So you can look at these side by side, read the example about the cat in the box to try to better understand these. You can think of affirming the consequent fallacy as a poor imitation of modus ponens. Again, when we assume the premises are true, the conclusion just doesn't follow from those premises, right? No matter what A and B or P and Q or whatever represent. So in a way, you can think of formal logic as kind of absolutist, because modus ponens is always valid, and affirming the consequent is always invalid, no matter what we plug in for those words. Now, to understand what I just said, you need to understand what valid and invalid is. So look at my video called How to Evaluate Logical Arguments if you're confused with that. Now, remember from a while back, there's only two ways arguments can go bad. They can have bad premises or bad form. Another way of saying they have bad form is they have a bad inference, okay, bad reasoning. So to drive this point home, consider the next argument. You can see it on the screen here. If you are correct, then pigs are flying. Okay, you are correct, therefore pigs are flying. Now what's interesting is that this argument is actually valid. It's not a formal fallacy. I immediately know it's valid because it takes the form of modus ponens. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Right? Where A represents you are correct and B represents pigs flying. Again, this and any other argument that takes the form of modus ponens is valid because the conclusion must be true if we assume the premises are true, if we imagine the premises are true. That's what valid means, right? Does the conclusion follow when you assume the premises are true? Now, you might protest and say the first premise is false. It's false that if you are correct, then pigs are flying. And this is true. But again, formal fallacies are not about whether the premises or conclusion are true. They're about the form. They're about whether the conclusion really follows when we imagine or assume the premises are true. Right? Okay, so I would reject this pig argument, but not because it has bad form or bad inference, but because the first premise is false. I just don't think it's true that if you're correct, then pigs are flying, right? Okay, let's consider two more argument forms. On the left, you can see modus tollens, which is always a valid argument form. And on the right, you can see denying the antecedent, which is always fallacious, invalid, a poor form. Now, denying the antecedent, it's fallacious. It doesn't matter what those letters represent. Here's an example. If goodness rules the world, then God exists. Goodness does not rule the world, therefore God does not exist. That's the argument. Now, many people will be confused and distracted by the terms in this argument, right? But students of formal logic bypass that if they had a good teacher, right? Because they can immediately see the argument as a formal fallacy, denying the antecedent. So such a person, such a student might say, even if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't follow. This is denying the antecedent fallacy. On the other hand, people who haven't studied formal logic may struggle with this and ask complicated questions about the nature of good and God and what it means to rule the world. So what I'm trying to sell you on here is that the study of formal or symbolic logic is indeed valuable, even though most people don't believe it until they actually learn and practice it in the proper way, right? So there you have it. You've learned three formal fallacies: illicit conversion, right? All A or B, therefore all B or A. Affirming the consequent, if A then B, B therefore A. And denying the antecedent, if A then B, not A therefore B. And you learn two valid argument forms: modus ponens, if A then B, A therefore B, and modus tollens, if A then B, not B therefore not A. When you study the formally fallacious and formally valid argument forms, it's like you're developing a new tool, or metaphorically loading new software onto your wet brain, right? You're learning to see the world in a new way. And with this ability, you can more quickly and accurately evaluate many arguments. Also, studying formal logic will give you the ability to teleport to distant planets and other dimensions. Trust me. Okay, so as you listen to arguments from loved ones, the media, your brilliant professors, and so on, take a moment to put them in form. Test the form, right? So if I say something, put it in form. All A or B, he said, if A then C, and so on, right? And learn the valid and fallacious forms over time. There's many of them that you can learn. Eventually, you'll have the advantage of seeing in form as well as content. So you'll have an advantage over content creatures who only see the world in terms of content and cannot therefore transport themselves into the formal universe that Plato talked about, full of palm tree essences and ocean essences. Okay, let's do some practice problems now. Okay, in this exercise, tell me whether it's a good argument, whether it's valid or invalid. And if it's invalid, what fallacy, what formal fallacy is it? So number one, if I'm happy, then I'm singing and clogging. True. I'm singing and clogging. That's true. Therefore, I'm happy. Okay. So notice this form. This argument takes the form if A then B, B therefore A, and that's always fallacious. It's a formal fallacy called affirming the consequent. Look at number 2. If Adam is a man, he is mortal. He is a man, therefore he is mortal. That takes the same argument form. I don't have to think much here. It's if A then B, B therefore A. So again, what we have here is a oh, I'm sorry. Actually, number 2, if Adam is a man, then he is mortal. He is a man, therefore he's mortal. That actually takes the form if A then B, A therefore B. So that is a good argument. That's a valid argument. It takes the form of modus ponens. So number 2 on the screen is a valid argument. It takes the form of modus ponens. Look at number 3. If Bob is washing dishes, then Bob is angry. Bob isn't washing dishes, so he isn't angry. Okay. When you look at number 3 about Bob washing dishes, that is a formal fallacy denying the antecedent. If A then B, right? Not A, therefore not B. That's always fallacious. Okay, let's try this again. You can see the answers on the next slide here. And here's the next exercise. Now number 4 and 5 are tricky. Number 4 says my consciousness is physical because my neurons are physical. So let's put it into form. X has this quality because its parts have this quality, or its causes have this quality. Now this is not a formal fallacy because you have to think about the content. Number 4 is actually an informal fallacy. Okay, it's the fallacy of composition that we learned in the video called 22 Common Fallacies. Now number 5 takes the same form. Every brick in the wall is red, and there's nothing but bricks in the wall, so the whole wall is red. It moves from the parts of the whole, But number 5 is not in a formal fallacy. Number 4 is an informal fallacy, but number 5 is not. In this case, you can move from the parts of the whole. So number 5 is a good argument. Okay. Now, again, it's not the composition fallacy since all the parts of the wall are red and the redness seems to transfer from the parts of the whole. Look at number 6. All clowns are dangerous people, so all dangerous people are clowns. Okay. That says all A or B, so all B are A. So I'm going to reject that argument, even though I agree with the premise and conclusion. I'm going to reject it because it has bad form. It's invalid. It's a formal fallacy, right? And this formal fallacy, if you remember, look in the next slide here, is a illicit conversion. Okay, on the next screen you can see some other fallacies you would encounter in a formal logic course. Undistributed middle, illicit minor, illicit major are some that come up in Aristotelian logic. And I want to emphasize that if you're studying formal or symbolic logic, you might not get the point of it, especially if you're a humanities major. But I think this video and my other video, like how to evaluate logical arguments, that particular video, can really help you benefit from the course. Because what you're doing in those courses is learning to see in forms. And that can be very useful in life, to see arguments in forms and not just in matter of content. Okay? And again, it can, well, let's summarize the whole thing there. Okay. So what's the lesson here? Studying formal logic, which is the forms of arguments, will help you more quickly and accurately evaluate all most arguments. Okay? It will also give you the ability to teleport to distant planets and dimensions like Plato's formal realm. Okay? Thank you.